So hello, welcome everyone. Today we're very happy to have Melanie Weber to present at the network seminar. So first of all, Melanie defended her PhD yesterday, so congratulations to her. We're very happy to have you the day after. Hopefully you're still alive a little bit. And also Melanie will join the department next year as a Hook postdoctoral fellow. So again, congratulations to that. But today she's here to talk about some of her work, about the discrete curvature and some applications of that. So Melanie, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot for the introduction and also for the invitation to speak. So it's great to give a talk at Oxford even before officially joining the department in the fall. So, oops. Yes, so in my talk today, we will take the perspective of viewing networks as geometric objects. So our overarching goal is to understand the structure of complex systems by understanding the geometry of complex networks that we build from data that we gathered about those complex systems. Since this is a network science audience, I probably won't have to introduce much notation, like what vertices and edges are, but just to note, throughout the talk we will denote with V the edges of the network, and G will always denote a graph or network, and capital E the set of edges of the network. And then a lot of network analysis classical network analysis mostly focuses on vertices and on information that is associated with vertices, but curvature-based analysis, the perspective that we will take today, at least the curvature notions that we will consider today, take an edge-based perspective, so look at edge information. And when we view networks as geometric objects, we can take either an extrinsic or an intrinsic perspective, and we will look at both throughout the talk. So if we take an extrinsic perspective, we take the metric information that is encoded in the network and use that as a basis to represent the data in a continuous space. So we might perform a node embedding into a Euclidean space, or maybe also a non-Euclidean space like a hyperbolic space or other manifolds. So here we don't define the geometric tools directly on the network, but we use the metric information to embed, to represent the network in a space where those geometric tools are available. We could also take an intrinsic perspective where we define the geometric tools that we need, in particular curvature, directly on the network. And this will be the other perspective that we are taking, where we mostly focus on notions of discrete curvature, in particular Ricci curvature. Okay, so as the general overview of the talk, we will start with discrete notions of curvature, in particular Ricci curvature, since that's the curvature notion that I have mostly studied myself. And we will also talk about some applications of such curvatures in network analysis. The work that I'm going to talk about is mostly joint work with Jürgen Joost and Emil Sorkan, and some other collaborators at the Max Planck Institute for Mathematics and the Sciences in Leipzig in Germany. And then in the second part of the talk, we will focus on representation learning aspects. So here we are guided by the question, given a relational data set, or you could think of as a network, how can we identify suitable spaces for representing the data, such that the geometry of our data aligns well with the geometry of our space, and how do such choices impact the performance of downstream analysis methods, especially when thinking about applications in machine learning. And this work is partially based on joint work with some collaborators at Google, which are listed on the slide here. But let's start with discrete curvature. So if you have studied differential geometry, you might wonder why it is useful to define a notion like curvature in a space where there's no natural differential structure, which is certainly a very valid question. And before I formally define the curvature notions, I want to give some intuition on that question. So if you're familiar with differential geometry, you've probably seen definitions like this of the curvature operator in Riemannian geometry. And this, of course, assumes that we have a differential structure. So just taking that curvature tensor and one-to-one translating it to discrete spaces might be problematic. Our goal with defining curvatures in discrete spaces is more based on analogies. So we want to define curvature notions that preserve certain local or global properties that can also be expressed without a differential structure. So maybe in the differential geometry sense, we know that spaces with a curvature bounded above have certain properties. And then analogously, we want networks with a curvature bounded above to also fulfill certain properties in a global or local sense. To give some examples of that, so the kind of the notions of curvature that we could in principle consider that exists in differential geometry and that we could consider for networks are sectional curvature, Ricci curvature, or scalar curvature. Sectional curvature being the most general or most global notion. This is a notion, so in differential geometry, you could measure a sectional curvature, for instance, with the thickness of triangles. Similarly, in network geometry, we would look at triangles, or in the sense of Gromov hyperbolicity, we would measure a 4-point condition. So we use very similar notions to define discrete curvature than what we would do in differential geometry. And just like in differential geometry, discrete notions of sectional curvature measure global network properties and can also quantify relations between distant vertices and not only neighboring vertices, for instance. In contrast, Ricci curvature is in the differential geometry sense a local average or a local mean of sectional curvature, and similar to that, the discrete notions of Ricci curvature also give us local notions that quantify local network properties. In the discrete sense, we will see that Ricci curvature is defined with respect to edges, where we can compute the Ricci curvature of an edge just by using the edge, the adjacent vertices and their neighborhoods. So we don't need to look at the network as a whole. We can just look at the local information, and we can take properties about the edge into account, like weights or directionality. And then in contrast, the scalar curvature is defined with respect to vertices. So this would mostly encode node-based information, and there exist various notions, but usually they're strongly associated with node degrees. So, and as initially said, we mostly want to focus on Ricci curvatures, mostly on Foreman's Ricci curvature, and also briefly mention Olivier's Ricci curvature. So to give some geometric intuition, we've already said this, but just to show it in a picture. So Ricci curvature can be seen as an average or a mean of sectional curvature, or you could say a local proxy of sectional curvature. And the formal definition in differential geometry has to do with geodesic dispersion, so it's associated with the volume growth on the respective manifold. And then we will see that the discrete notion of Ricci curvature will be associated with edge dispersion, so measuring a very similar geometric idea. The two notions of discrete curvature that are classically considered in the literature is Olivier's Ricci curvature and Foreman's Ricci curvature. Olivier's Ricci curvature is defined based on optimal transport. So here we have a mass distribution on, so for a given edge, we have two adjacent vertices, and then we have a distribution of mass on the neighborhoods of those vertices, and then we compute an optimal transport from one neighborhood to the other. So we have to solve an optimal transport problem to compute the Olivier-Ricci curvature for each edge. And as you might imagine, that's unfortunately quite computationally expensive. So if we want to use Ricci curvature in practice, and in particular compute it for very large scale networks, this can be difficult to do with Olivier's Ricci curvature due to this computational expense. But from a theoretical point of view, Olivier's Ricci curvature is a very nice notion. It very naturally connects to clustering. So for instance, we can derive bounds on the clustering coefficient with respect to Olivier-Ricci curvature. And it has also been studied in many theoretical contexts. Yeah. Forman-Ricci curvature, on the other hand, implements this basic idea of edge dispersion. We will see this shortly when we formally define Forman-Ricci curvature. And here, the key advantage of Olivier's Ricci curvature is its computational efficiency. So we will see it's very easy to compute based on just the local information, and can be very easy parallelized and implemented in a scalable way so that we can also compute this for very large scale networks and can use it in practice. And we will see some sample applications later on. So most of the talk will be quite non-technical, so I will not go over any formal proofs, but the next couple of slides will be slightly technical because I want to show how we can embed or derive Forman-Ricci curvature from the curvature notions in differential geometry. If you're interested in any theoretical details related to what I'll be saying throughout the talk, please send me an email and then I can point you to the respective literature. So in order to derive Forman-Ricci curvature, we start with a relation which is called the Bochner-Weizenberg formula in differential geometry. It's a relation between the Riemann-Laplace operator, the Bochner-Laplacian, and the curvature tensor that we've seen earlier. And here, as we said earlier, the first obstacle that we encounter is that we have no natural differential structure on networks and also more generally on cell complexes. So note that in general, this notion of Forman-Ricci curvature is not restricted to networks. So in the most general sense, we could define Forman-Ricci curvature on cell complexes. So besides networks, that includes, for instance, hypernetworks or simplicial complexes or polyhedral complexes. So it's a very general notion and could be adapted to many different geometric objects. But given a cell complex, if we want to find a combinatorial analog of the Bochner-Weizenberg formula, we replace the differential structure with the boundary operator. Illustratively speaking, what the boundary operator does, if we start with a square, we apply the boundary operator, we get its edges, and then if we apply the boundary operator again, we get its vertices. So in using this structure, we can replace the differential structure in the Bochner-Weizenberg formula and then get a combinatorial analog. So this was first proved by Forman in the paper that is listed here on the slide. And then using combinatorial analogs of the two Laplacians, the remainder essentially gives us a combinatorial curvature function defined on cell complexes. And this can then be specialized to one cells. So if we are interested in networks and want to find an edge-based notion, then this would, in the language of cell complexes, correspond to looking at one cells. And then for the remainder of the talk, we will define the curvature function on these one cells as our Forman-Ricci tensor. And then this was like the high level idea, but if we actually do the math and derive the curvature function in detail, this is what we get for the general curvature function on P cells. And then if we specialize that to the case that we are interested in, to the one cells, the networks, this is the notion that we get. So you see here that the Ricci curvature depends on local information. So we have the the weight of the edge that goes in here, the weights of the adjacent vertices, and also what we call parallel edges. So for instance, in this schematic here, E V2 is a parallel edge of the edge E that we're considering because they share a vertex. And then also in the more general curvature function, similarly, we take child cells and parent cells into account. So for instance, for this triangle here, or sometimes also called a face, would be a parent of this edge E, and then a child would be one of the adjacent vertices, for instance. So this structure of child and parent, as you might imagine, is induced by using these boundary operators. So, but in the sense of just the edge-based Ricci curvature, this simplifies considerably because we only have to take parallel cells and vertices into account, and the weights associated with those. From a Ricci curvature, yeah.
These weights, can you put anything? Is it like positive numbers or negative numbers, or can you choose?
So yeah, so if you have so typically the convention is that weights are positive, and then if you have a negative weight, that would indicate a directionality. Yeah. So you can also define with a slight modification, you can define curvature on directed networks, but in the notion that was here on the slide, you have to assume the weights to be positive, and then weights on the vertices are also typically positive.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of like interpretation, would a high weight mean something like closer together in the sense of like the geometric sense? Or?
Well, so that those weights typically are not something that you would impose on the network, but they arise in practice. So here I'm assuming you have some network that is given, and then typically from the context, maybe like, so if you, for example, as it is noted here, if the edges correspond to a strength or associations between entities, right, then the edge weight maybe say something about the strength of that association, or so in that sense, the weights typically arise in practice.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Okay. So with that slide, I just briefly wanted to mention some relations between Foreman-Ricci curvature and other network characteristics. So Foreman-Ricci curvature is closely associated with the notion of dispersion, which has mostly been studied in the context of social networks, and is essentially a measure of common neighbors. So if you have pairs of vertices and then you measure the common neighbors, so you could also see it as a measure of associated triangles. And this is closely related to the idea of edge dispersion, and can therefore also be linked to Foreman-Ricci curvature. Another measure that's closely associated is assortativity. So you can show that Ricci curvature tends to be high whenever the adjacent vertices have a high degree, and through that there's a link to between high curvature and high assortativity. One specific application in the context of network analysis that my collaborators and me have studied is to use curvature to understand the global network structure, and in particular to capture important features in the network. So for that, we use the notion of a network backbone, how we call it. So if G is our starting network, we want to identify a subnetwork G prime that contains structurally important nodes and edges. So structurally important can be something like nodes with a high degree or a high betweenness centrality, and edges. Structurally important edges are typically bridges. So for instance, if we have communities in the network and then we have edges connecting those communities, those could be structurally important, for instance, or edges that connect high degree vertices. So with those bridges, you might expect, since Ricci curvature is an edge-based notion, that there's a natural connection to the bridges, and that is the case. So we see that we have, as previously mentioned, we have a high curvature whenever the adjacent vertices have high degrees. And if the weight of the edge that we're considering is large compared to those of the associated parallel edges. And this naturally links to bridges. So if you would select for such edges in the network, that would usually coincide with what is typically called a bridge in the literature. So to link this to applications, this notion could be used in two different contexts. So first, in general, just identifying and characterizing the higher order structure of the network, but also to perform a task called sampling. So think of a very, very large scale network that was built from data in practice, maybe data that was noisy, and you want to reduce or subsample the core network, an essential substructure, or what we previously called the backbone. So what we could do is either to perform some thresholding with respect to curvature, or maybe use some more fancy sampling methods to sample edges and their adjacent vertices based on the value of curvature. So before I show some real application, to give one example of a network that is small enough so that we can see what's going on in the network and what our curvature-based methods detect here. So this is a network where the vertices are characters in a well-known French book that I think most people in the audience have heard of or maybe read. And we have an edge between characters whenever those characters have met in the book. And then here in this representation, we have, for visualization purposes, scaled the size of the vertices with the degree of the node degree in the network. And here we see the biggest vertex is Valjean, which is also the central figure, one of the central figures in the book. And then by subselecting this core structure based on curvature, we identify the two main storylines in the book. So the people centered around Valjean that he mostly interacts with, and then also a second cluster around the group of revolutionaries. And then we also identify here the bridge, we could say, the edge that's connecting these two clusters of vertices. So this is just a representation of what we see here, since it's maybe hard to see the edges that are marked here. So this is, of course, a toy network where if we know the storyline and if we have read the book, we can probably identify those even without network analysis tools. But we could also use these tools and apply those to make sense of large scale networks where it's not so easy to see what's going on. And in particular, I want to show one example, which was a collaboration with neuroscientists at the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics in Tübingen. So those are listed here, Gabi Lohmann and Johannes Stelzer. And they work with fMRI data. So they record themselves fMRI data with volunteers. And also perform analysis of that fMRI data. In particular, they have developed a method for building brain networks out of this fMRI data that has the noising step built in, since fMRI data tends to be quite noisy. And in this study, we looked at the networks built with their network construction tool. So we use those as an input for our methods. And then what you see here on the left-hand side is the curvature distribution for 10 sample networks. So those are fMRI measurements on 10 different individuals that participated in the study. And this is the curvature distribution of the resulting networks. And here we see a mixture of two networks, of two we see a mixture of two distributions in a sense. So that's indicative of two functional subnetworks in the input network. And we subselected those networks and then traced back which voxels were involved, were activated in that subnetwork, and to which brain regions this corresponds. And here we see for the big distribution, so to say, that corresponds to the functional network that you would see activated in an emotion task. So this was the task that was performed by the individuals in the study while they were in the scanner. So if I recall correctly, the emotion task means that they were shown different pictures with faces and essentially had to react to those visual inputs. So I'm not a neuroscientist, but my collaborators were quite pleased with what the activation patterns that we see here in those plots. And then we also identify a second functional network. This corresponds to the default mode network, which you would measure if no specific, it's like an unspecific task is performed, or if you would just have someone measure someone as a sort of as a baseline without performing any task, a kind of resting state measurement. And that is also consistent with what we see here when looking at the activation patterns. And then in a second study, we also used those methods to analyze biological networks. Maybe I go through this a little bit more quickly, but here we looked at two kinds of networks. One were metabolic networks and one were co-expression networks, where we again looked for identifying these functional subnetworks. And here in the metabolic networks, a core structure that we identified were hydrogen reactions, which is also consistent with what we would expect from a chemical perspective. And for the co-expression networks, we identified a core structure corresponding to housekeeping genes, which is also what you would expect from a biological point of view. And then just to briefly mention, so we've seen earlier this curvature function was defined not only on networks, but also more general on cell complexes. So we could look into simplicial complexes. We could also look into hypernet networks, which have recently gained a lot of interest. So here, instead of having edges that connect two vertices, we have hyper edges that connect groups of vertices. So maybe here in this example, we have a group of 4 vertices that is associated by some relation with a 5th vertex, and then the edge connecting those we call a hyper edge. And then similarly to before, we could specialize this curvature function that we have. Here we have a certain directionality built in, so we have to look at the incoming information and the outgoing information and define separate curvature notions for both directions. And then we can summarize that into an expression for the form in Ricci curvature of one hyperedge. And then again, this could be used to analyze hypernetworks. So those are, for instance, also being used in a chemical context. So there are some people, including at the Max Planck Institute, where my collaborators work, that look at building hypernetworks out of chemical data and then using such methods to understand their structure. Okay, and with that, I want to conclude the part about discrete curvatures, and we've also seen some applications to network analysis, and want to move on to the representation learning aspects. So I'm sure everyone here in the audience knows this, but just for completeness, so we know that in machine learning or in applications in general, we encounter everywhere relational data. We might study social networks. In natural language processing, we might look at knowledge graphs. We look at biological networks like the fMRI brain networks that we've seen, also protein-protein interactions. So it's important to think about how to represent relational data in a suitable way so that we can apply downstream machine learning methods. So we have already briefly talked about the workflow here, but just to repeat, so we might start with some raw data. So this could be the fMRI measurements that we've seen earlier, or chemical compounds, or genes that we saw earlier. And then based on the relations in those data sets, we built complex networks. So we've seen examples of brain networks where we looked at correlations of activation patterns of voxels. We've also seen briefly co-expression networks that were built from gene expression data. And then once we have networks, we can either directly analyze the structure of those networks, or sometimes it can be useful to embed the network into a continuous space, so to perform a node embedding. Here we would use the metric information contained in the network. So we could look at the path distances in the network as a measure of distance between vertices, and then we compute node embeddings. So we choose a target embedding space, either a Euclidean space or a Riemannian manifold. And then we want to map each vertex to a point in our continuous target space. And we want to preserve the distances between our vertices as best as possible in order to preserve that metric information. And this mapping, this continuous embedding, is especially interesting for machine learning, since a lot of the methods that we'd like to apply might require a differential structure, might require gradients. So in many settings, it can be suitable to perform this embedding and to make sure that we find a good space that is suitable for representing the structure that we find in our networks. So this area of geometric representation learning focuses essentially on two aspects. One is the embedding aspect itself. So in practice, given a data set, how do we compute a good embedding into a target representation space? So classically here, usually Euclidean spaces were considered, but more recently also hyperbolic spaces or mixed curvature spaces. So those would be product manifolds. And then a second aspect that has been studied in the literature and that I'm particularly interested in are representation trade-offs. So given a data set, given a data structure, what are good embedding spaces such that the geometry of our space aligns well with the geometry of our data? And in the context of graphs or networks, that has been studied from a very fundamental mathematical perspective for canonical graphs, for instance, by Bourgain and Lineal, and also more recently from a more empirical data-driven perspective by a group at Stanford from Chris Ray, for instance. Also myself and collaborators at Facebook have looked into this. So given a data set, how can we efficiently identify a good space for representing our data? And then this always in the context of downstream machine learning, and especially if our target space, if we identify that our target space should maybe not be a Euclidean space, that other spaces are more suitable for representing the geometric structure of our data, then we also have to think about how to generalize machine learning methods that classically assume a Euclidean setting to non-Euclidean settings. So just to recap the workflow or the objectives here. So we first have to understand the geometry of our data in data space and identify a good continuous space such that the geometry of our target space aligns well with the geometry that we identified in our data space. Then we actually have to compute this embedding using a hopefully efficient method so that we can do that in a scalable way even for large data sets. And then once we have data represented in a continuous space, we have to ensure that we have the algorithmic tools available that we need for our downstream analysis. So we might have to generalize an algorithm that typically assumes a Euclidean setting into a manifold setting. And what I will mostly focus on in the remainder of the talk is this representation trade-off aspect. So given a certain data set, how can we identify a good embedding space? And then only briefly mention the second aspect of generalizing algorithms, of translating algorithms from Euclidean to Riemannian settings whenever those are more classically studied in Euclidean settings. Okay, and just to recap, we already mentioned it, but a good embedding typically preserves similarity relations, so preserves the metric information that we have given in our data space. So if we have two similar entities in a network, those could be nodes that are neighbors, for instance, then we want them to be close by in a metric sense also in our target space. And if we have dissimilar entities, so maybe the path distance in the network is on the order of the diameter of the network, then those entities are presumably dissimilar and should be in a metric sense further apart in the target space. And such good embeddings are typically achieved whenever the geometry of our data aligns well with the geometry of our data space. And just for efficiency purposes, we should keep in mind that ideally our target space should be as low dimensional as possible, since many of the methods that we apply in downstream machine learning will have a complexity that scales with the dimension of our space. So it's always preferably to identify a continuous space where we can embed our data in a low dimensional setting. And I want to give one example of why this alignment of the geometry of our data and the geometry of our space is important. This is not at all related to networks. I know this is a networks seminar, but I still want to give this example to illustrate the idea. So the example that I want to show is the Mercator projection, which goes back to the Flemish geographer Mercator, and it's a way of mapping, of generating world maps, so of mapping the surface of the Earth into a two-dimensional world map. So geometrically speaking, we map the surface of a sphere onto the two-dimensional Euclidean plane. What happens here is illustrated in this scaling. So here we start with the usual world map, as we know it from high school probably, and then it's rescaled to the actual sizes of the land masses as they are in the real world. And here we see that the length scales close to the equator are pretty well preserved, but as we get further away from the equator, we see that the actual sizes of the land masses are much smaller than represented in the classical world map. So in particular, if we compare the size of Mexico, which is right at the equator, and the size of Greenland, which is very far away from the equator, then we see that Greenland appears overly large, although it's about the same size as Mexico. And this representation error is what we call mathematically distortion. And that's here a result of not having the geometry of our data well aligned with the geometry of our space, because it's not possible to faithfully represent a two-dimensional spherical geometry in a two-dimensional Euclidean plane. And what this also illustrates is if you now imagine you learn a model on such a misrepresentation of the length scales, then this representation error already significantly biases and impacts your model, and it's going to be really hard to correct for that in a downstream analysis. So we have to be really careful when aligning, when choosing a representation space, and make sure that the geometry aligns with that of our data. So what kinds of spaces could we consider in practice? In practice, we could consider any Riemannian manifold besides the classical Euclidean space, which of course is just a special case of a Riemannian manifold with curvature 0. In practice, what we typically do is we restrict to spaces with constant curvature, because that makes the mathematical tools a little bit more tractable and also aids in actually implementing the resulting methods that we want to apply downstream. So in particular, we consider, besides Euclidean spaces, hyperbolic spaces, which are Riemannian manifolds with a constant negative curvature, and spherical spaces, which are manifolds with a constant positive curvature. And then in the network context, it's important to note that each of those model spaces has an associated canonical graph structure, which is known to embed very well into the respective space. So for Euclidean spaces, that's the lattice. For hyperbolic spaces, that's the tree. And for spherical spaces, that's the cycle. And then if we look into the classical mathematical literature, we see quantitative results on this representation error, this distortion that we've seen in the Mercator projection example. And then we can also mathematically show that, for instance, a tree embeds very well into hyperbolic space, but incurs a significant representation error in Euclidean space. And similarly with the other canonical graphs, if we embed them not into their canonical model space. So this gives us very precise results for canonical graphs. But of course, the real-world graphs that we encounter will not be canonical graphs. So for instance, if we just look at a simple example like the Karate Club, we will find a lot of cycles, we will find substructures that are tree-like. So the kinds of data sets that we encounter in practice are very heterogeneous, and it's not clear how to apply those classical results from the mathematical literature. One thing we could do is to use the discrete curvature notions that we have considered in the first part of the talk. So those discrete Ricci curvatures. We could also use Gromov's delta hyperbolicity, which is a discrete notion of a sectional curvature. As the name here already says, Gromov's delta hyperbolicity is especially good at detecting hyperbolicity, so tree-likeness, but not really at distinguishing between the other model spaces. And unfortunately, similarly for the purely edge-based Ricci curvatures, which are good at detecting hyperbolicity, but not so good at distinguishing between embeddability into other model spaces. I'm getting short on time, so I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly. What we could do for the Forman Ricci curvature in order to make it easier to detect these coarse model geometries is that instead of looking at the Ricci curvature for one cells, we look at the Ricci curvature of two complexes. So this also involves looking at Ricci curvature on zero cells. So in the network context, vertices, then the usual one cell Ricci curvature on edges, and also the two cell Ricci curvature on faces. So for instance, for triangles and other cycles that appear in the network. Unfortunately, computing those higher order curvature functions is much more computationally intense than just computing the edge-based curvature or the vertex-based curvature. We can reduce this to the computation of a set of auxiliary functions that I'm not going to go through in detail, but just to note the advantage that we've seen earlier for the Forman Ricci curvature, that it's very easy and very efficiently to compute, suffers once we take these multiple orders of curvature functions into account. And based on these curvatures for cell complexes, we can define a network theoretic analog of another characteristic from differential geometry, the Euler characteristic, which is closely connected to this embeddability question. And in particular, we see if this network theoretic characteristic is positive, then that's indicative of a good embeddability into spherical space. And if it's zero into Euclidean space and negative into hyperbolic space. So this could be one way of getting an idea for a given heterogeneous network on how to identify a good embedding space. Another way would be to use this analogy to volume growth. So we've already seen when defining the discrete Ricci curvature that this is closely related to volume growth and to geodesic dispersion. More generally, when we look and analyze why lattices embed well into Euclidean spaces and why trees embed well into hyperbolic spaces, we see that that has to do with an alignment of the volume growth rates. So in particular, in Euclidean space, we have polynomial volume growth, just as we have in lattices. And in hyperbolic space, we have an exponential volume growth, which is also what we see in trees. So here, of course, in continuous spaces, we have the classic notion of volume growth. And then in discrete spaces, we would look at the neighborhood growth as an analog. So one idea also to empirically identify a good embedding space would be to measure the rates of volume growth, of neighborhood growth in our network, and use that as a proxy for embedding curvature. Maybe I skip through this. So basically the idea here in practice is to measure volume growth rates in a given network. There are particular ways for this is why this is noted here as through regularity. So there are particular ways of measuring those in an efficient way that I maybe not go into, but just to note there are efficient ways of measuring and estimating these volume growth rates in networks. So here we would look at the neighborhood of each vertex in the graph and perform our analysis of the neighborhood growth rates, and then assign each of those neighborhoods a score depending on what order of expansion we see. And then we aggregate those scores across the network to identify what are the dominating volume growth structures, which will give us a proxy of what embedding curvature to choose. So if this aggregated score is positive, then we want to embed into a spherical space. If it is negative, we want to embed into a hyperbolic space. And if it's approximately 0, we want to go with the Euclidean space. And then maybe to quickly show some experimental results if we apply this score in practice. So as I mentioned, this is just a combinatorial computation that can be very efficiently implemented, and therefore also applies to practical analysis and to even look at large-scale data sets. So here we started with some synthetic analysis. Of course, if we generate these canonical graph structures, then what we detect is exactly what the theory would predict. We also did an analysis of Erdős-Rényi graphs. So here, as I'm sure you all know, depending on the edge threshold that you choose in an Erdős-Rényi graph, you see certain phenomena. So in particular, there's a phase transition for a certain edge threshold where a giant component, a large connected component appears in the graph. And then if we further increase the edge threshold, there's another phase transition at which the sampled graph becomes fully connected. And there's a theoretical result in the literature with respect to Kromov's delta hyperbolicity that provably shows that hyperbolicity emerges in the graph with the joint component. And this is also something that we saw in our experiments, that the graph becomes hyperbolic as we get to the threshold where we have a giant component. And then if we further increase it and reach the connectivity threshold, then it's becoming less hyperbolic and less suitable to an embedding into a hyperbolic space. And then we also looked at some real data sets as a sanity check. So for instance, social networks, which are known to be very hierarchical, very tree-like, are also shown in our analysis to be very suitable for hyperbolic embeddings. And then maybe for one other example, if we look at the geographic distances of cities and try to embed that would be very suitable to a low-dimensional spherical space. Perhaps not surprising, since we see since the cities were, if we assume that the Earth is approximately a sphere, then the cities are points on a spherical structure. And then we also compared this to optimization-based embeddability methods. So instead of a priori analyzing the geometry of our data, we could also just brute force take the data sets and embed them into Euclidean, hyperbolic, and spherical space, and see where the distortion, the representation error is the lowest, and then take that as a measure of what's the best space to embed in. Of course, that's much more expensive than just performing this simple combinatorial computation. But we see here, if we do this this extensive analysis of actually embedding the data, then that agrees also with the score that we compute in this analysis. Okay, and now I'm almost out of time, but I very briefly want to touch on machine learning in hyperbolic spaces. So to illustrate why it's also from the perspective of downstream machine learning important to pick the right space. So note that with those examples that we've seen earlier of examples of relational data that we might encounter in machine learning applications, that a lot of them are hierarchical. So for instance, word nets or social networks have a hierarchical structure. In the word net, for instance, animal is a very general concept, then bird is a more specialized concept, and then canary is an even more specialized concept, right? So this concept structure introduces a hierarchical structure. So we would expect and also see in practice that such data sets embed very well into hyperbolic spaces and can be very accurately represented in hyperbolic spaces. And then in the downstream analysis here, we looked at the problem of learning classifiers in hyperbolic space. So we can generalize classical methods like the perceptron that we would use to perform a classification task in Euclidean space, also in hyperbolic space. And then for the specific task of learning a robust classifier with empirical risk minimization, we see that, so here we have, we could look at a Euclidean method and at a hyperbolic method and look at how the complexity scales with respect to the dimension of the space. And we see that that scales exponentially, has an exponential dependence on the dimension of the space. And using that, we can show that for data that embeds well into hyperbolic space, that those complexity guarantees are actually much better. So that's also from a theoretical perspective, provably better to learn the classifier in hyperbolic space as opposed to Euclidean space. So it's really important to detect the right space and then choose the right algorithm to perform the classification task. Okay, and we can also see that in practice, but I'm not going to go into that. And yeah, maybe I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melanie. Yeah, so indeed, you probably need 1 more hour to say everything, right? But luckily, there's another talk of you at the data science seminar in June. So looking forward to seeing more about that. But I think we have time for some more questions. There was one in the chat already from you. I can read it if you want. So use Andre is asking, I'm wondering what the curvature measures would be when applied to bipartite networks. So if you have thought about that.
So I've not put, do you mean if there are any specific bounds or something that you could give on the curvature if you know that your network is bipartite? Is that the question?
So I'm not sure if you want to add something to that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the questions, and I want to know if I apply the curvatures, like what extra point I can get from these measures, rather than applying others.
Yeah, so I have not myself looked into bipartite networks, but I think someone at the group of Jürgen Jost has. In particular, in the context of chemical networks, since those tend to be naturally by construction bipartite. So I can't tell you offhand, but I think there are some results on that. Yeah, you get specific relations or like specific bounds, I think, on the curvature if your network is bipartite. But I can't tell you offhand. If you send me an email, I can look it up for you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, if there's any other questions, feel free to unmute and just ask. Or type in the chat if you prefer. Otherwise, yeah, I can ask one already, and then in the meantime, someone can think. I had a question with this. Well, you showed like in several places, you showed like experimental results where you calculate the curvature, and it always seems it's very negative. Is that something, well, that you expect, or and like, is it reasonable that you won't find positive curvature that often?
Yes, so the form in Ricci curvature, just the edge-based notion, is in fact always negative. So that plays into what I was saying, that we can't really detect positive curvature, because Ricci curvature is by construction always negative unless you have a very degenerate graph structure. And I think similarly with the Olivier-Ricci curvature, but if you look at these higher order curvatures, so at the cell complexes, then you can also get positive curvature, and then it makes more sense from this embeddability perspective. So that's why I was briefly mentioning that. But for just looking at the edge-based notion, yeah, that's not suitable for detecting like a model geometry.
Okay, because I was also wondering, like in at least a differential geometry case, like positive curvature, if everything is positive, it has like special implications. So that's also not something you could detect with the form in Ricci curvature.
Well, not with the just edge-based notion. Yeah, but if so in the general context, right? So this form in Ricci curvature is really like a class of curvature functions on different on different sort of refinements of the objects that you look at, of these complexes. So yeah, if you want to preserve certain properties, you just have to sort of take the a more comprehensive version of that notion. But for the network analysis cases that we have looked at, it's sufficient to look at just this edge-based notion, and that is very efficiently computable. So in those applications, we were really looking for something that's efficiently computable. Otherwise, you could also use, for instance, the Olivier-Ricci curvature, but it's much harder to compute. So it wouldn't that wouldn't be efficiently enough to, for instance, analyze these large-scale brain networks that our collaborators were looking into.
Yeah. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Can I just a short question? So you mentioned the fact that in the case of the other Schrödinger graph, depending on the density, you would expect different curvatures. And so I was just wondering, in a real world graph where you also have regions that may have very different densities, you might thus expect that this assumption or requirement that you have a constant curvature in the whole graph is not verified, right? That in certain regions you would have like positive, others negative. And I wondered, is it something that people consider to try to do some sort of like a clustering problem, where you try to partition your graph into regions that have a constant curvature? And maybe that in different clusters you would have different measures of curvature?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So certainly this restriction to constant curvature spaces takes a lot away from the geometry. So you're definitely right. I'm aware of one work that looked at mixed curvature spaces as an embedding space, so a product manifold where the components had constant curvature. Right. So here you can, I think this is similar to what you were explaining, where you have you basically detect different regions in your relational data that have that are well approximated by a certain constant curvature, and then you patch those together into a product manifold. Yeah. So I'm aware of one such work, but I think there's no principled or systematic analysis yet. But yeah, that's certainly in order to sort of make full use of the geometric structure that we find in the data, that would be certainly the right approach. But then if you think about downstream applications, there's already not much work on extending those classical algorithms to constant curvature manifolds. Yeah, and then once you go into varying curvature or product spaces, this becomes even more difficult. So that's one of the things why people in practice focus on constant curvature embeddings. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks. Thank you.
Okay. I'm not sure if there's any other questions. Otherwise, yeah. I think we're also, it's 3 p.m. So I think we can wrap it up. Thanks so much, Melanie. It was a really interesting talk. And well, at least I will be happy to join the talk in June. I can also send it around to the network seminar for the rest who is interested. And otherwise, we will see you in fall, I guess, here in Oxford.